Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today we're getting into my top 30 running back rankings for week 3 of the fantasy football season. I will admit it was very, very tough putting these rankings together this week. There's a lot of, I would say, mid running backs that are entering the fold with a lot of opportunities, or some running backs that are pretty solid that are into some tough matchups. So again, run through the top 30 as well as some guys that are outside of my top 30 I will mention as well, helping you make your start sit decisions for this week. Guys, if you do enjoy the video, if you find it valuable with the information you're getting, would really, really appreciate if you did hit that like button. And as well, subscribe to the channel, would greatly appreciate that. As well, today's video is brought to you by the Stunt. If you guys haven't checked out the Stunt, it is a all sports social media app. So it takes all your favorite things about all of your social media apps, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, whatever it might be, brings it all to one place, and it's only sports. We're posting on there daily. I'm sharing some exclusive content there that we're not putting out on our YouTube channel or on our TikTok. So we really, really appreciate if you guys downloaded the Stunt there. Very, very proud sponsor of the show. The link to sign up is down below in the description as well. Put it in the pinned comments. And on Fridays, we haven't had a lot of people joining us on Fridays for our live rooms. We're live from 4 to 5 Eastern time. I'm answering all of your start sit questions. We're going through all of these updated matchups to see, where injuries are at heading into the weekend and how that might impact your team and who you should start and who you should sit. If you guys are looking for more advice like that, would love to chat with you guys. Would really appreciate if you joined us on there on the Stunt. Again, the link is down below to download the app, and then drop OwnersBox a follow there if you can. That'd be awesome. But let's get to the top 30, starting with the number 1 guy in the week, Christian McCaffrey, an obvious RB1 in this matchup with the Giants, who through the first 2 weeks of the season are 24th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and as well 27th in EPA per rush. So they have struggled immensely against the run so far. That was on display against the Cardinals as well. James Conner going for over 100 yards. For McCaffrey, I was looking at the odds at FanDuel for him to score a touchdown. It was over minus 300. So they're definitely expecting him to find the end zone this game. Matchup is great. Tony Pollard is my RB2. The Cardinals as well have been a team that's pretty middling. They're 18th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 19th in run defense grade. So pretty well in the middle of the league when it comes to against the run. But the game script here should be great for Pollard. He's getting vast majority of opportunities. This team is in around the 5, inside the 10, looking to score touchdowns. Pollard is their guy there. At 3 is Derrick Henry. Henry going up against the Browns, who have vastly, like Jim Schwartz has taken over as the DC. They look a lot better against the run. Now they haven't faced 2 incredible running backs in Joe Mixon, and then last week was Najee Harris, who looked absolutely terrible. But they're 6th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They're actually 1st in rushing EPA, so have been very, very good against the run. But the Browns have struggled offensively a ton the first 2 weeks of the season. Yes, they beat the Bengals. The matchup with the Steelers didn't look good from an offensive perspective. So this will keep the Titans in a game script where they can run the football, and that is exactly what they want to do with Derrick Henry. At 4 is Travis Etienne. Etienne in a really plus matchup against Houston. Houston is dead last in run defense grade. They're 19th in EPA, 27th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So a great matchup here for Etienne. Tank Bigsby's role really fell off because of some of his mistakes in week 1. So that makes Etienne a top 5 guy for me, no problem there. Josh Jacobs finally gets a chance here to get right. The last 2 weeks have been terrible. You're really regretting ever drafting him, and you're probably 0-2 to start the season if you drafted Josh Jacobs, but the Steelers are a prime matchup here. They're dead last in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and without Cameron Hayward, they have looked brutal. So, got a great matchup here. Got a team that struggled against the run. Jacobs will get some volume. I think this will be a competitive game that will allow the Raiders to run the football and ride Josh Jacobs in this matchup. At 6 is Joe Mixon, a matchup with the Rams. The Rams have looked okay in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're 29th in rushing EPA, 26th in run defense grade. Get right spot here for the Bengals against this Rams defense, who I think is still very underwhelming. I've run into 2 matchups with divisional opponents where they've definitely had a good game plan. Here, they get a Bengals team they haven't played probably, I would assume, since the Super Bowl, if I remember right. So Mixon with a chance to get right here. He is on the field pretty much every snap. I think over 70% of snaps on the season, so love him in this matchup. At 7 is Bijan Robinson. The Lions have been okay. They look a lot better in my mind against the run. They're 17th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 13th in run defense grade. I still love Bijan. He's my RB7 on the week, which might seem a little bit low, but I do expect this matchup to be one where they can run the football and find success. There's no reason not to be starting Bijan off that big week. At 8 is Alexander Mattison. Mattison gets the Chargers. I know it's been tough for him the first 2 weeks. 2 really tough matchups against Tampa and Philadelphia. We got a great one here against the Chargers, who are 29th in run defense grade and 21st in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I expect a big week here for Mattison in finally a plus matchup because he's on the field a ton. At 9 is Kenneth Walker. Walker's definitely a guy you want to be playing. I know, last week was tough efficiency-wise, but scored those touchdowns. Carolina's 31st in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 22nd in rushing EPA, so they have not been good. We saw Tony Jones be able to find the end zone last week. I do expect here with a more talented running back to find even more success for Kenneth Walker, so like him there. 10 is Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones getting the Saints this week. I expect him to be back and be on the field. We'll see if that materializes. There's a couple other guys that I didn't include in these rankings because I do expect them to miss, but Jones is a guy I do expect to be back. The Saints are top 10 in fantasy points allowed to running back, so a solid group, but they are 24th in rushing EPA. So it does seem like, although the fantasy points haven't materialized, their run defense isn't quite as good as it looks right now throughout the first 2 weeks. 11 is Kyron Williams. Definitely someone I'm pretty high on this week compared to what probably the expectation was going into the season. But Cam Akers didn't play last week. I wouldn't expect him to play this week. That puts Kyron Williams in a matchup with Cincinnati where we've seen the Bengals offense struggle. So if this game can stay in more of a neutral game script, I could expect them to be running the football. And after the matchup against the 49ers, I can expect them to be more efficient in this game against the Bengals. We're still solid, but 23rd in EPA against the run, not great. And then 19th in fantasy points allowed to running back. So there's an opportunity here for Williams to be taking that volume and being a little bit more efficient. We've already seen him plenty involved in the receiving game, which is great too. Closing out the top 12, we got Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson has a matchup with the Jets. Volume has been good for him. The Jets have been a pretty decent run defense, 7th in run defense grade, 16th in EPA against the run, 12th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Stevenson's getting that vast majority of opportunities in this Patriots offense, and we now have a matchup with the Jets where scoring probably won't be at quite the level it's been for their previous two opponents in the Eagles and Dolphins, so Stevenson could be getting the ball quite a bit here. All right, heading into our RB2s for this week, we're on to James Conner, my RB13. He has got a matchup with Dallas, who's definitely a tough matchup. Obviously, the Cowboys are first in fantasy points allowed to running back so far. They've just been blowing their opponents out. They haven't been able to run the football much, but the thing is with the Cardinals is I do expect Conner to be involved regardless of the game script, and as well, they're going to continue to give him volume even in games that they'll be trailing because, Josh Jacobs isn't a quarterback they can trust. I don't think they can trust really their receivers as well. Conner has been the focal point. They should look to run the ball a little bit in this game early on, especially when you talk about the Cowboys' pass defense and pass rush and how good it is. So I do still think you can start Conner with some confidence despite the difficult matchup. 14. I didn't think I'd be this quickly to go back to Isaiah Pacheco, but he's my RB14 on the week. A matchup with Chicago. Chicago is 29th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They have been solid against the run. The thing is they've just been trailing in both games, and teams have been able to move the football there as they look to kill clock. I do expect that to be the same for the Chiefs. The Chiefs are like a 13.5 point favorite, 14 point favorite in this game. And Pacheco, the signs are good. He's been on the field as a receiver a decent amount. He's obviously being the primary guy running the football as well. Yes, McKinnon's involved a little bit. Yes, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is getting on the field. In this matchup, I do expect Pacheco to get a good enough volume here to be efficient, to be able to be productive, and potentially find the end zone too. So I do feel like you can play him with some confidence this week. At 15 is Raheem Mostert. The Broncos have kind of struggled against the run. Their front four has fallen off a little bit from what it was last season. 23rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and they're 20th in both run defense grade and EPA per rush. So we've got Mostert in a matchup where they're 6-point favorites. Mostert's volume has been awesome. We had a cut coming off a big week last week that I really didn't expect. So volume should continue to be high, and Mostert's a guy you can trust moving forward. Definitely a guy if you drafted, you're feeling really, really good about how the year started for him. At 16 is James Cook. Cook has seen both Latavius Murray and Damian Harris take away opportunities in the red zone from him, but he's continued to be productive. And Washington is a matchup where they're probably going to be in a positive game script. Regardless, though, James Cook is plenty involved as a receiver, the primary guy there, but Washington's been pretty solid. That's why I don't have him a little bit higher in my rankings. 8th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They are also 17th in run defense grade, so more middle of the pack there. But I do think a lot of teams respect this Commanders front, and being able to run the ball will be tough. But Cook has been one of the most efficient guys in the league so far, and great in yards after contact per attempt too, one of the top backs there. So this is a guy you can really trust moving forward. At 17 is Dameon Pierce. Pierce is a player that, it's been really brutal the first 2 weeks, and a lot of it's come down to this team being in some brutal game scripts to be able to trust him. I feel like maybe I should have him a little bit lower in my rankings, but it is a guy that I know is going to get volume. The Jags have been really good, 3rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, top 10 in EPA, top 5 in PFF's run defense grade. So it's a tough matchup. I feel like with Pierce being on the field this much, I don't think Jacksonville's run front is as good as some of the opponents they've had so far. are. Like the Colts have a fantastic run front. The Ravens have a fantastic run front. I think the Jaguars are still good. I'm not sure if they're as good as they've been the last 2 weeks with matchups against the Colts, who had Deion Jackson running the football, and then they just faced the Chiefs' rushing attack that I don't think is all that terrific. So I think Pierce could find some success. At 18 is Joshua Kelly. We haven't talked about Austin Eckler. I do think Eckler will miss again this week. Kelly, I mentioned this when we were talking about this on the Stunt when we were previewing these matchups and these injury reports. I thought Kelly was a guy you shouldn't be feeling confident in playing. That was the case, but now you get the Vikings defense, who's nowhere near as good as the Titans. 20th in fantasy points allowed, 31st in run defense grade, and 25th in rushing EPA. This is a matchup where Kelly should be much more involved, and they will be much more willing to go to him, so you can definitely start him with some confidence this week as a solid RB2. 19 is Miles Sanders. Sanders gets the Seahawks. The Seahawks have been a team that have been, I think, a little bit improved against the run. The fantasy points perspective doesn't prove that. They're 26th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're 12th in run defense grade, top 15 in EPA. So for Sanders, who's still sharing the third, like Chuba Hubbard's getting on the field on third down, he's sharing a little bit of early down work with Chuba Hubbard as well. I do think Sanders, although the matchup looks solid, he's sharing a little bit too much for me to feel like top 12 potential guy here, but he's still a player that you definitely want to be starting with his opportunity and with the matchup. At 20, DeAndre Swift. Yes, Swift coming off the massive week 2 against the Vikings defense. Tampa Bay has been legit against the run. 9th in fantasy points allowed, 7th in EPA against the run. They're still very good defending the run. I know Tampa Bay is a team that might struggle to win this game against Philadelphia, but if Kenneth Gainwell is back, I do think that Swift's role won't be as secure as many might think. Now, I'm still not completely sure Gainwell will be playing in this game, but I do think there's a chance, and I think anyone could run behind that offensive line against the Vikings run defense. It was brutal, and I just don't expect if Gainwell is back that there is full confidence and full go in Swift being the guy. There's a reason why they went to Gainwell to start the season, so just something to monitor. I definitely still want to start him. I'm not looking to put him on my bench, but that's why I don't have him as high as probably some others might have him. At 21, Brian Robinson. Man, Brian Robinson is off to an incredible start to the season. I'm not a big believer in his talent, but he is getting on the field far more often than I expected, especially in rush or in passing situations too. He's like, last week in week 1, he ran more routes than Antonio Gibson. This week was a little bit more even, but the Bills defense, team that's a little bit tougher to be able to find that success against. 16 fantasy points allowed, 11th in rushing EPA. So it won't be as easy sledding here, but with Robinson's role in this offense, how it's been the first 2 weeks, he's definitely not a guy you want to be sitting. That's for sure. 22, Craig Reynolds gets Atlanta this week. Atlanta's been a team that has been vastly improved against the run in the first 2 weeks of the season. 7th in fantasy points, 4th in run defense grade, 5th in EPA. So I'm starting to change my tune here on where Atlanta was last season to how they look this season. Reynolds, when David Montgomery left, we talked about this on the waiver wire video. When David Montgomery left, Craig Reynolds basically just took David Montgomery's role. I know they signed Zonovan Knight. Craig Reynolds has been around the team for multiple seasons now. I think he's going to take David Montgomery's role and just become a serviceable guy you're going to be able to start, because he's going to be the guy running the ball a little bit more than Jahmyr Gibbs. When they get in the red zone, he's going to be the guy giving the scoring opportunities, and I do think the Lions will find plenty of scoring opportunities against Atlanta in this game, regardless of their improvements against the run and their improvements from their defense. I still think there'll be a decent amount of points in this game, so Reynolds will be the guy to score those touchdowns for Detroit. At 23, Breece Hall. God, the Jets backfield was really ugly last week. We saw three different guys running a decent amount of routes in Dalvin Cook, Michael Carter, and Breece Hall, and they also split the rushing opportunities. Breece Hall is the number one guy for me. Like, I do think that Hall will be the one they're leaning on the most. He's going to have some problems when it comes to nursing that knee throughout the week and keeping him off the field in more in limited fashion in practice. I still think he's the number one guy here. So in a matchup against the Patriots, who really struggled against Miami's run defense, but I do think they were just leaving a lot of light boxes for the Dolphins to run into. I'm not high on Breece Hall this week, but he's still narrowly in my top 24 because the Patriots are still top 10 in both rushing EPA and PFF's run defense grade. At 24, closing out the top 24, Jahmyr Gibbs, a matchup with Atlanta. I talked about Atlanta's run defense when it came to Craig Reynolds. I do think Gibbs is going to see more opportunities. So as much as he isn't, a slam dunk play, I think he's going to be on the field, obviously get a decent amount of receiving work, and then he will get a bit more of a share than what he previously had with David Montgomery, now with Craig Reynolds. So that makes him a little bit better of a start when it comes to comparison from the previous 2 weeks. Closing out the top 30 at the RB25 is Rachaad White. White has a matchup with the Eagles, and the Eagles have found an answer when it comes to their run defense. They're second in EPA against the run, second in run defense grade, fourth in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter have vastly improved this run defense. And for Rachaad White, I think it will be very tough sledding when it comes to efficiency and when it comes to being able to get some opportunities to score. So I'm pretty low on Rachaad White this week. You can start him because the volume has been really high and the opportunities in snap share have been good. So that keeps him from going outside my top 30. But the matchup is very difficult here. So I would, if you're in one of those more shallow leagues leagues, he's definitely a guy I'd be looking to sit this week. At 26, Jaylen Warren. Look, I'm done with Najee Harris. I've given him some respectable rankings the last week especially, and been absolutely burned because Harris looks incredibly slow. He looks like he's running just to not lose yardage, and Jaylen Warren has been running explosively hard and creating big plays both as a receiver and as a runner. And Najee Harris is probably going to be coming off the field all the time in passing situations because we had a couple of drops last week as well. Warren will, again, be able to create yards after the catch. He had over 50 receiving yards. I think Warren gets on the field even more as a runner in this game. So he's a guy I feel like I need to be playing in my deeper leagues. Obviously, in some of your shallow leagues, you're not going to be looking to him as the RB26 on the week. But the Raiders are a team that have really struggled. 31st in rushing EPA, 30th in run defense grade, 28th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I still think this offense is terrible. They don't seem to be run blocking well, so I'm not high on either one of these guys between Warren and Harris. But I'm starting Warren over Harris this week because he got on the field more in that second half. Yes, Harris had 2 big runs to eclipse, 40 rushing yards in the game. But the way Warren's getting on the field in those receiving situations and how much better he's looked as a runner, I am now making the decision here that I do expect this Steelers team to go with him a little bit more often in this matchup. 28 is Tyler Algier. Algier was a guy I was really high on last week and kind of got burned by. He still had his opportunities, didn't run the ball that well, didn't convert on some opportunities he had inside the 5. We saw Bijan Robinson look fantastic, so I don't know how he doesn't get a little bit more opportunity there and takes away from it a little bit more of Tyler Algier's opportunities. So a matchup with Detroit is still a solid one. 18th in EPA against the run, 17th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So not a terrible matchup, and I still think he'll get some opportunity. So I still think you can start him this week in some of those deeper leagues. But if you're not, you might want to sit him based on these rankings too. At 28, Justice Hill. So Gus Edwards was the one that put together the fantasy performance for the Ravens last week, but it was Justice Hill getting more opportunities, running obviously more routes, actually getting more early down work as well, had all the advantages basically. Edwards just happened to be the one to find the end zone. So I do think Hill's a serviceable player this week against this Indianapolis defense, who's been really good against the run. Number 1 in run defense grade, 3rd in rushing EPA. And so I do expect Baltimore to struggle to be able to run the ball. So that'll put Hill on the field a little bit more than Edwards is. And Hill was still getting some opportunities inside the 5 to score touchdowns too. So I don't think this is a Gus Edwards number 1 guy in this backfield. This is going to be a split, and that hurts both of their values. But in this matchup, Hill would be the guy I would start over Edwards. 29, Tony Jones. Jamal Williams is definitely going to be out. I don't expect, Condre Miller could play in this game, but I'm not sure as a rookie how confident they are in going to him. Tony Jones has been around the team for a couple of seasons. Got a matchup with the Packers, which is definitely a positive one for running backs. We obviously saw Jones find the end zone on Monday night. The Packers 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 25th in run defense grade, 28th in rushing EPA. So if you pick Jones up off the wire, I do think he's has a decent floor to be able to start him. We'll find out about the ceiling here to see what happens with Condre Miller. But as of right now, I could see you playing Jones as a decent flex option considering the matchup too. 30 is Javonte Williams. Matchup with Miami. Miami has not looked good against the run. The Vic Fangio scheme comes in. It kind of has had them looking like quite a bit worse of a run defense compared to last season. 30th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 32nd in rushing EPA, 23rd in run defense grade. But the thing is with Denver are they going to be in a game script where they can run the football? Because Williams is coming off the field in some of these passing downs for Samaje Perine. So despite the matchup, I don't think that Miami is as bad as some of these numbers indicate. They're definitely worse compared to last year and not a top 15, top of the league unit. But for Williams in this matchup and the way Denver's offense has struggled, I'm not completely in on absolutely making him a must-start type of guy this week. Okay, some of the guys that are outside my rankings. I'm still not starting any of the Bears running backs. They're 14-point dogs in this game. Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson are guys I still got to figure out, unless we see more refinement in this backfield in terms of role, in terms of one guy taking over, then I could start to consider playing one of these guys. But as of right now, that's not really in my consideration. Zach Moss in far too difficult of a matchup with the Ravens to consider starting him. I know he had a big week last week against the Texans. That will not continue against the Ravens run defense. Jerome Ford, picked him up off the wire. He's my RB35 this week. Look, you play the Titans defense, you're not going to score fantasy points. Simple as that. I definitely don't want to start Jerome Ford in the matchup with the Titans, who are the best run defense in the league. Ford will need to do way too much in the receiving game to be a serviceable start, and I'm not willing to risk it. So those are some of the guys I have outside my top 30. If there's any players that I did not mention that you do want to hear about, be sure to drop those down below in the comments. Happy to answer as many of your questions as I can. And as well, shout out to the Stunt for sponsoring today's video. Guys will be live on there 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday Eastern time. Again, that is answering your start sit questions, updating on these injuries to be able to help you set your lineups this week. Would really love it if you guys join me. Would love to chat with you guys on there and enter the live room with us. Again, follow OwnersBox on the Stunt. The link to download the app will be down below in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.